Hello everyone, my name is Jordan Farmer and this is once again episode 2 of the Uncommon Ground podcast. I already did one, but the one I released originally was not up to par for me, so I wanted to do another one to give a more complete picture than I did originally. I don't think I fully achieved the goal that I was going for with that first video. So to start off, why I'm doing this podcast, which is fixing the economy, is obviously because we're in the midst of a very, very steep recession, the worst one since the Great Depression, that was brought on by the lockdowns, because once all economic activity, or once large amounts of economic activity are forced to be stopped suddenly, obviously the economic activity is going to go down. We peaked at about 25 million people out of work, starting off with a couple million, and since then we have actually, and the Trump administration and Congress deserve credit for this, between the policies that they've instituted and the reopenings that have taken place, at least partially, we've brought back 9 million of those jobs that were lost, about 22 million jobs that were lost, which is good, but we have a long ways to go, and it looks like that trend might be slowing down a bit. I mean, 9 million jobs in 3 months is a great trend, it's a great rate, but we have a long ways to go. We have 13 million or 15 million, depending on how you want to calculate it, jobs we still need to fill, and that's quite a stretch, and the stimulus that they already passed probably will not get us all the way there. Especially because many states are still locked down, so recovery is not possible in a certain sense, in certain areas. So that's a problem. But I also wanted to make this video, fixing the economy, because economics is one of those issues that really transcends borders. It's a human issue. It's a survival issue, a cost of living, or a quality of life issue. And so it applies to basically everybody, and good or bad economic policies mean a better or a worse life for millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of people. Not just within our borders, but because we trade. If our economy is richer, we can do more trade with other countries. We can enrich them more. It helps everybody. So good economic policies are just, I mean, almost automatically and inherently good, but I have come across some people who don't value them as much as I do, so that's my pitch. Helps lots of people's lives. I hope that matters to you. And so the recession obviously is part of the reason, and also it's an issue that applies to everybody. And if you understand the history of our economic, within the frame of American politics, if you understand our economic history, you can better understand where we're at, why we are where we are, what the obstacles to solving the problems we all want to solve are. And also, economics is a very universal, the goals are pretty universal for economics across the political spectrum. Everyone wants high wages, everyone wants economic growth, everyone wants everyone to be successful, and good economic policies are pretty objective, in my opinion. They're not as subjective or value oriented as many other political issues are. So it's a lot more black and white, a lot more systematic and structured. So let's get into it. First off, if you want a book to read or an audiobook to listen to that's a good, more thorough sort of grounding in economic thinking, I would suggest to you Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell. He's one of the most profound economic thinkers of definitely the 20th century and probably the 21st century as well. So I strongly recommend his work. Look into other people, but his work is particularly foundational, in my opinion. And that book is just phenomenal, and all of his work is phenomenal. So yeah, now we're going to get into it. So when you're talking about economics, you're talking about the marketplace, where goods and services are exchanged and sold, and those goods and services vary along quality and price. Obviously, cheaper prices, more expensive prices, you understand. The people of economics that are involved within economic activities fall into one of two camps. There are laborers who exchange their labor, their life, in exchange for a fixed rate of return via wages or salaries, bonuses, whatever. And then separate from them, but there's overlap, are capitalists, or people that make their money off of their capital, people that invest, people that own companies and grow companies, all of that kind of stuff. Capitalists, laborers, those are the two basic camps that the people operating within the marketplace fall into. But there's overlap. People can be both a laborer and a capitalist. So these two groups of people operating within the marketplace will engage in one of three types of economic activity: production, consumption, and investment. Consumption is kind of where all economic activity starts, because once human beings that have money want stuff and will trade that money for stuff, people will then respond to that and produce things in order to get the money from those people that are willing to consume and give up their money. So consumption drives production, and production is always responding to consumption. So if you have a growing consumer market, most likely you'll have a growing production market as well. Now, when consumption fuels production, it does so via paying a price, and that price, contained within that price, is a reimbursement for the cost of production, part of which includes labor value, and then also profit on top of that, which goes to capitalists and is their income and their and creates their ability to consume and then reinvest, and then also laborers' ability to consume and reinvest. And then the cost of production is just the cost of production, and ongoing games where consumers are trying to find the cheapest products and the best quality products, and they keep paying the people who make the better quality products or the cheaper products. The people that are making the best quality products or the cheapest products will constantly gain ground within the marketplace, and goods and services will be more abundant and cheaper as time goes on, because of that constant competition to produce or provide those services or those goods to the people that are offering the consumption and that are demanding it. And then investment is just constantly the constant redirection of capital within the system to create more efficient or more profitable production. So we've got the people, we've got the activities, and now we need metrics within the marketplace to track success or failure for our political policies. These metrics include average income for individuals, median household income, GDP, which is a measure of the productivity of a country, jobs, which is obviously the demand for labor and probably the most important metric for laborers, unemployment, which is extremely important, and that does not measure the total number of people who don't have jobs. It measures the total number of people that are actively looking for jobs that cannot currently find jobs. So people that have jobs and that are looking for jobs are considered the active labor pool, and the unemployment rate is the measure within that group of people. It's the measure of how many of those people are unable to find work currently. Then you also have the labor participation rate, which is a measure of the total available labor supply and what percentage of those are actually working. So that's more of what you would think an unemployment rate would probably be, but it's different, labor participation rate. And as the labor participation rate goes up, that increases the number of jobs and economically active people that we have relative to the population. And obviously that is better, because that would mean we're more productive, we have more value relative to the cost of living for all of those human beings. Balance of trade would be another one. The inflation rate would be another one. Interest rates are another one. And then the value of different currencies and commodities across the world, including things like oil and gold. All those kinds of numbers are good to track, just in order to kind of understand what's happening in the economy, and then also to determine what success and failure looks like. you want higher GDP growth rates, and those are reports on GDP growth are given out quarterly and annually. And I encourage you to pay attention to both, because paying attention to the quarterly numbers will give you a more nuanced view than paying attention to just the annual numbers, but both are good. The jobs rate is announced on the first Friday of every month, so look out for those reports. And also there are corrections usually in those reports, meaning in the previous months jobs were too low, jobs were underreported, and so they have to correct for that. So pay attention to that, because that, if there's often lots of upward corrections, then that means that the initial numbers are consistently underreported. And then if the corrections are constantly downward, the initial numbers are usually overreported, and that will give you a more accurate sense of those numbers when they come out every month and what they actually mean. Because if you know every single month is going to have an eventual downward or upward correction, then you can correct for that when they come out initially. And then most of the time you will be right or wrong. The unemployment rate is actually weekly. Numbers come out on that weekly often. And then another metric to pay attention to would be cost of living, which is basically, rent, utilities, food, clothing, gas, things like that. The labor participation rate is something that you generally want to see having an upward trend as time goes on, but you can't force people to work, so sometimes that might not always be the case. But if there is a decreasing trend, you can usually attribute it to something. But if it's kind of zigzag, it is what it is. 1950 to 2000, we had a steadily increasing labor participation rate, and then starting from 2000 to 2016, that trend reversed, and we had consistent 16 years of a downward slope in the labor participation rate, and we've seen a leveling out so far in the Trump administration. And in 2, 3, 4 years, we'll see where, if he's still in office, we'll see where he gets us in time. Obviously, we want a low unemployment rate, we want decreasing cost of living, and we want a rising average income and a rising median household income, because you can have a rising average income because the rich are getting richer, but that doesn't necessarily correlate to the average person. But the median household income will give you a measure of the sort of average Joe's household and what they're making. And so growth in that number particularly is very, 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 very important. So we have the marketplace, we have the people, we have the activities, we have the metrics, and now we need some principles for how we are making decisions as far as policy goes within economics. The first of those principles is just the observation of the fact, it's not even really a principle, I don't think. Maybe it's a principle of thinking, but it comes from just the observation that decentralized systems outperform centralized systems in innovation, utility, and effectiveness, and variety of operation. They outperform centralized systems on all those fronts tremendously. And it's because of the relationship between the number of decision makers within a given system, the consequences of those decisions that they make, and the impact of those decisions. So when you have a handful of people making decisions in a system, that's a limited amount of brain power. But if you have the entire network of individuals making decisions in a system, and all that brain power is being used, obviously that means much more brain power, much better decision making in terms of the total range of good and bad decisions that'll be made. But the other side of that is just as important, if not more important, and that's when you have a decentralized individual system, the consequences of failure for one decision are the burden of that mistake is felt by one person. And then everyone else can actually learn from that mistake made by that one person. And so benefits can be widespread, but the costs of failure can be very diffuse and minimal, or very focused and minimal. So just to walk through this with a couple of hypothetical but essentially real life examples of this. First off, would you rather have would you rather have all individuals have the ability to control which products are made in these two examples I'm about to give? That's one question. And then the other question is, or I'm sorry, would you rather have all individuals choosing for themselves and trying to work to create this product and give it to every single individual? Or would you rather have a committee in Washington, D.C. in charge of creating this product and getting it to every single individual out there as much as they can? The two examples of products I'm going to give, one is deodorant. Now, deodorant varies based off of scents. It varies based off of antiperspirant versus deodorant. It varies based off of rub-on versus the spray can. And then also lots of people are going to have allergy issues. So we'll say there's two different types of allergies associated with deodorant that require specialized choices. If the first scenario is the case where you have individuals making decisions for their own production of deodorants and purchasing of deodorants, etc., they'll be able to screen for their own allergies very, very effectively, and they'll be able to pick the exact types of things that they want, and all the millions of consumer decisions that need to be made will be made very efficiently because it's made by all those individuals. If you have a committee in charge of that, the committee might forget that certain people have allergies, or send an alert, send a product with a chemical within it that someone's allergic to. They might send that to someone accidentally, and then that consequence leads to tens of thousands of deaths because of that allergy, because they send that same product out to everybody. And even if they could figure out a handful of the factors and scents and things like that, they have to make it, they have to ship it, they have to get it to you, they have to make sure it's what you want. Obviously, you don't want a committee in charge of that. And then the second example I gave, or that I was going to give, but I'm not even going to explain it, because it's a joke if you even think a committee could possibly ever do this. A computer. Do you think a committee could come up with a computer? Could create a computer from just having meetings and talking? No, you need to have unique individuals with the freedom to create, that can create these little innovations that have gigantic impacts over time. And you need to have the dynamic economy to actually scale up those inventions and actually make them available and abundant to everyday people. The other principle that I want to talk about, and I'm not even sure if it actually fits as a word principle, but it's just the word I'm using. The other principle we should maintain when considering economic policy is what I call labor scarcity. Labor scarcity is kind of associated with the labor participation rate, because as it goes up, labor is more scarce, and thus it's harder to hire people. There's few people available to hire, right? But the labor scarcity that I'm referring to as a sort of state of policy, or a state of conditions within the economy, particularly within the labor pool, the labor market. The type of labor scarcity I'm talking about is when the number of available jobs in the marketplace exceeds the number of unemployed people actively looking for jobs. Now, they might not always be in the same area, and so we need to have local unemployment shrunk down as well, which requires local good policy. But at this macroeconomic level, looking at the United States as a whole, as long as we have a situation where the total number of jobs available exceeds the total number of unemployed people, I call that labor scarcity, which means that there's jobs and employers that are actively looking to hire people that can't find people, and so you start having employers competing for employees instead of employees competing for jobs. And this grows wages because it is the demand exceeding the supply systemically. So labor scarcity is very, 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 very important when it comes to economic thinking. Now, standard economic theorizing sort of assumes a fixed economic system, and then all the models operate and all the equations operate within a fixed system typically. But the real world, and particularly trade, is not that way. It's the interaction between systems, and each country has its own tax code and own laws, own philosophies, and own tax rates. I might have already said that, but each country has its own thing. So, and trade is the interaction between systems. So although this hypothetical consumption, production, investment sort of system and constant efficiency building and all that stuff growing the economy, although all that's true, that's a fixed system, and trade is the interaction between systems. and because of that, that means that consumption and production can be separated. So you can consume something in one country, but then the production, so the cost of production and the labor value and profit, is in a different country. Or at least in the case where you have trade and you have this happening, you can have it so that or usually it's the case that the labor value is completely in the other country, but the profits are split between the domestic business and the foreign business in question. All right. So next we need to consider that each country has its own labor market, its own labor pool, its own consumer market, and its own production market. So, but all of those different types of markets and all countries on the planet are all competing for the same global capital pool, because you have currency exchanges. Money can switch forms whenever it needs to, so all capital on the planet is available to all countries that wish to compete for it. So we need to have that competitive mindset, and we need to understand that other countries have their own consumer and labor pools that they are concerned about. Okay, now I'm going to hit you guys with some really big picture ideas and some big time commentary on our economic history. From 1865, when the end of the Civil War, all the way through till 1945, all the way till 1970, with the Great Depression obviously being one of the exceptions during this period. From 1865 to 1970, the U.S. economy grew at an insane clip, particularly post-World War II. From 1945 to 1970, we had insane growth during those years. And from 1940 to 1960, the poverty rate in the black community went from 87% to 47% during this insane economic boom. So, or during part of this insane economic boom from 1945 to 1970. And right around 1970, a decision was made by the people that actually run our country, or that were in charge of the politicians at the time, to change the fundamental goal of the U.S. economy and U.S. policy making from growing the domestic economy as much as possible to growing the global economy as much as possible. And those two individual goals mean giant differences when it comes to policy, huge differences when it comes to policy. The main crux of this change in sort of goals and policy making, or at least one of the main effects of it, was majorly diluting the value of labor through systemic macroeconomic policy. So certain policies exist outside of redistribution of wealth that do affect the natural distribution of wealth that laborers get when they're working in the marketplace. Oh, and I'll just throw this point in there now. Labor scarcity does not get achieved for a very long period of time as an economy grows, because you're starting off with a huge labor supply and virtually zero jobs. So it takes a long time for those jobs to accumulate to the point where there's any labor scarcity and wages really grow fast. And so in this vein, the U.S. policy making was designed to screw the American laborer, and American laborers were sold out in 1970 because of this change in goals. Now, this took place for a variety of reasons. This took place through a variety of mechanisms. Sorry, that's what I meant to say. Inflation does it in two different ways. First off, the money that is actually being printed, or the new currency that's being generated digitally or otherwise, that money goes into bank vaults to provide extra capital for loans to mainly businesses, but also people. But this constant excess of debt that's available and capital that's available basically makes it so that businesses have like an endless piggy bank of debt that they can pull from, and they also use that debt to fund mergers and acquisitions and accelerate the rate at which a handful of companies gain control over the entire marketplace. And that is itself a distortion, and that's why 50 years ago we were, in 1970, we were the land of small businesses, and now we are the land of giant corporations. The other way in which inflation negatively affects labor is because it or negatively affects the economy and negatively affects labor is because it dilutes wages and salaries as a share of the economy, as well as debt and savings, but the actual value of the economy does not change. So it shrinks labor and wage inputs relative to the overall value of things, and thus actually grows profits and tilts things in favor of capitalists and against laborers. So inflation hurts American labor in those two fundamental ways. It creates the excess capital, and it also dilutes wages and salaries directly. Because we have wages and salaries that are based off of the dollar, not based off of a concrete value. And we could fix this issue, not the where the money is going. We could change it so that it just goes out to people so that they can consume it. It just goes to the people. But I actually think that going to the banks for certain reasons is fine, and it should be left alone, and that's the way we should go. But on the other side, all wages and salaries should be corrected for inflation every single year or quarterly, so that the American consumption market and the American wages and salary values do not constantly get diminished. So you get the benefits of inflation, the benefits of this alternative system, without the drawbacks of wages and salaries being constantly devalued. So then we also have immigration. So I talked about labor scarcity earlier. Immigration is always talked about as if it's a one-size-fits-all category. All immigrants are the same, and obviously they're not. First off, if you came here illegally versus legally, that is an issue. It's a topic for another day, but that is an issue. It shouldn't be illegal. But even separate from that, then you have legal and illegal immigrants that do and do not commit crimes, and then within the criminal faction of that, you have some that are violent criminals and some that are non-violent criminals. So it's a very complex topic, but immigration as a whole, I will tackle another day. But for the sake of this discussion, we're just going to talk about immigrants in the economic sense. And many of my libertarian friends and other pro-immigrant friends will say that immigrants can create jobs, which is true, but it takes time. And what I'm about to say in terms of economic analysis of immigration has nothing to do with that job creation rate, because at any given one time, we have a fixed number of jobs, and at any given 1 month or year or quarter, we have a fixed job creation rate. So no matter what, jobs are a fixed commodity. Labor, however, is not. So immigration is the importing of labor, because the supply of labor is people. So if you bring in more people, you have more labor, then you increase the supply of labor. Now, if you have legal immigration, that's increasing the supply of labor at a certain rate, and that rate has massively accelerated since the 70s. But then if you have illegal immigration, it's completely uncontrolled, and so you almost are guaranteed to have too much labor importing into your country. So we need to control illegal immigration and end it, and we're on our way to being able to do that. But we also need to calibrate our legal immigration rate to only fill in the extra jobs that we have. So I talked about labor scarcity, where we have more available jobs than active people looking for work. Well, once you have that scenario, then you can actually bring people in through immigration, and it does not dilute wages at all, because it's not allowing the supply to exceed the demand. But if you have a situation where you have a recession or a massive job loss, so there's a massive decrease in the demand for labor, to continue to add supply to the labor pool during that period will only prolong your economic recovery and your decreasing unemployment rate. That's part of the reason why the recovery was so slow under the Obama years was because legal and illegal immigration was supplanting that decrease in the unemployment rate that would have come much faster otherwise. So we create jobs. So prior to this recession, we were creating jobs at about 250,000 a month, and we are increasing our own domestic labor supply by about 100,000 a month. So we had a gap of about 150,000 a month. And if you did not fill those with immigrants, then those would just go unfulfilled. We wouldn't have that tax base. We wouldn't have those additional consumer dollars. The economy wouldn't grow as fast. So as long as we maintain labor scarcity, as many immigrants as we can bring in as possible, that's awesome. We just have to maintain labor scarcity so that labor is not at a macroeconomic disadvantage relative to capital. Trade. So trade is the other side of that. You have the supply. Now you have the demand. So trade is production, which is the demand for labor and for jobs. By allowing production since 1970, so 1945 to 1970, no trade deficits. 1970 onward, started taking trade deficits. And in this period from 1945 to 1970, we had GDP growth rates of 8%, 12%, 16%, crazy high rates. Check it out. As soon as we started taking trade deficits, that immediately dropped. Like the two charts are identical. That immediately dropped to like 3-4% if we're lucky, usually like 2 to 4%. So what they started doing in 1970 was spreading production, or the demand for labor, out as they try to spread it across as many labor pools as possible to dilute the demand for labor as much as possible, to keep labor scarcity from occurring in as many countries as possible, to keep wages and everyday people from getting richer faster. Also, on the domestic front, having an intentionally bad or anti-economically competitive tax code is another way to hurt American labor. If it costs more to invest in America because of a bad tax code, it costs more to do business in America because of a bad tax code, and it costs more to hire people and pay people because of a bad tax code, then all the global investment's going to go elsewhere and not come into our country. So a bad tax code in and of itself screws the American people. Excessive cost of compliance, so regulations. I'll talk about regulations here. Regulations are simply inserting a base level of quality in the marketplace. So all goods and services vary along quality and price within the marketplace. And what regulations do is they insert a base level of quality, as an example, to say, at this restaurant you cannot sell tainted meat. Ergo, this base level of quality, non-tainted meat, comes with a certain base level of cost that's also added by having that regulation. So there's cost of compliance that's always going to be there within regulations, and you have to analyze regulations case by case in order to have the appropriate regulatory sort of policy. But if you have regulations that make businesses deviate from their most economical way of doing business, and it does so, and you do that with the regulations more so than is necessary, that difference between what is absolutely necessary and what is actually happening, that gap is the unnecessary cost of compliance, and unnecessary costs of compliance hurt the economy and hurt the American laborer. And then any direct tax on labor, such as the payroll tax, and I'll explain that in a minute, also hurts American competitiveness. Now, many mainstream economists, neoliberal and center-right conservative, as well as many political pundits, such as Ben Shapiro, will argue that by having the cheapest possible inputs of labor across the board, you create the cheapest products possible, you make consumption as efficient as possible, and thus you create maximum efficiency in the system, and the system is as good off as it's going to be. And by increasing profits as much as possible, you increase the total amount of investment out there in the world, and that will also grow the economy as fast as possible. Both of these premises are faulty. The capital one is faulty because most rich people that make lots of money, in the world that we have now, where there's a constant excess of supply of debt in banks because that we print money and that's where we put it, there's a constant supply of capital. There's no shortage of capital that can be financed via debt. So they don't actually put their capital out there in the world as much or as often. They'll often try to take loans out instead, and they'll just hang on to their money until there's a recession, buy into some stocks, and then blow it up. Or buy into stocks, ride the wave, and then exit, and then maintain your bajillions for the next few years. And on the other side of that, the fact that it makes consumption efficient, when you make consumption as efficient as possible, and so you take labor value out of certain countries to a massive degree, what you're doing is you're actually destroying the domestic consumer market, because so many individuals can't actually buy anything. And when you collapse the local consumer market, you don't have as much consumption fueling the entire system, and the system falls apart. That's what started happening after 1970, when we started taking trade deficits. That, along with going off of the gold standard and along with some other policies, led to the crazy high inflation of the 70s and the slow economy of the 1970s. And so to supplant that lost labor value in the 1970s, the Great Society programs were rolled out so that the people that had no income whatsoever would get just enough to make sure they can survive and keep consuming and keep fueling the machine to grow the global economy as much as possible. And so welfare does have that effect. It does have that effect of adding artificial consumption into the system, and thus growing the system artificially fast. So that's when you think about the enhanced unemployment, when you think about the PPP loans, and you think about the stimulus, all of that, that's not the business sort of cost of operations PPP loan stuff. The rest of it is all adding consumption to the market to help grow the economy and bring it back as fast as possible. And now to fixing the tax code. We need to start off with establishing how much the government should be taxing, and therefore how much the government should be spending, just overall, total federal, state, and local spending all together. And typically this argument is actually framed in the terms of directional arguments and a binary, which the binaries always suck, but the binary is tax cuts or tax hikes, raise or low, increase or decrease. The problem is they're both directional, which means if you think that cutting taxes and letting the private sector have more of its money, letting individuals have more consuming power, and thus increasing consumption or increasing investment in the marketplace, giving the private sector more of its own money to spend, that those tax cuts grow the economy. Or on the other side, tax hikes, that increasing taxes, taking more money from people and having the government strategically invest that money, that grows the economy faster. Or having them redistribute that money and then growing consumption in that way, that will grow the economy faster. The problem with both of these arguments is they have truth to them, but they're directional and they find a limit. If you increase taxes to 100%, the economy will collapse, you'll have no tax revenue, and you will have no system. If you bring the tax rates down to 0%, you'll be able to run your government as long as you can off of debt, and then eventually the currency will dilute too much, or the whole system is going to fall apart, and that doesn't work either. Sorry. Having a 0% tax rate also obviously doesn't work. You're not generating tax revenue. You'll go into debt so much that you'll inflate your currency, and you'll just collapse the economy from excess inflation. So both of those directional arguments just don't hold water. Now, getting back to my original point, how much should we be taxed? The answer to that is actually very obvious if you look at the data. When government goes from spending 0% to 25% of GDP per year, the GDP growth rate grows right along with it, because having those basic government institutions like courts and police and contract enforcement and infrastructure and a military and all those kinds of things, those create the stability that allow an economy to exist in the first place. In war-torn, constantly just violently being overthrown countries, you're not going to have a stable economy. It's just not going to work. So from 0% to 25%, the economy grows as government spending increases. From 25% to 30%, you have a neutral effect, and growth goes from 0% to 6% and then stays at 6% between 25 and 30% of GDP. As government spending goes beyond 30% of GDP, it has a diminishing effect and growth slows down. Right now we're spending about 38-40% before COVID and the shutdowns in this year. Before all this, and before we spent all this money, we were spending about 38% of GDP, which means that the economy would, as it would predict, would grow at around 3%. We were growing a little bit below that because we had some other issues slowing down our growth economically. So the answer to the question, how much should we be taxed, is 25 to 30% of GDP. Now, I believe in balancing data with values, because you have that range, so you have to decide within that range. I believe that life is inherently valuable, human life is inherently valuable, and thus labor is inherently valuable. So people that give up their labor in exchange for money should keep as much of that money and their life as possible. So I go to 25% within that range of 25 to 30%. But then we have the next question of how do we collect how do we collect that tax revenue? And there's basically three massive categories of taxes that we have to choose from: progressive taxes, flat taxes, and regressive taxes. So progressive, flat, and regressive taxes. Progressive taxes, everyone knows, rich pay a higher percentage of their income than poor people. Flat tax, same percentage of income for everybody. And then regressive taxes are where poor people pay a higher percentage of their income than rich people. And those are real taxes, and they really do exist. So in terms of the flat tax, if you convert that 25% of GDP into a flat tax, it's almost a 30% income tax, which is just too much for poor people to be able to handle. And also, by taking 30% of money away from poor people, not only is it too much of a burden for them to bear, but it will eat into their consuming power and it will actually hurt the economy. So a flat tax is out. Although I do like a flat tax because it adheres to equality under the law. And that leaves us with regressive or progressive. Now, obviously, regressive taxes are out, and I'll get to those. I'll get to those right now. Regressive taxes fall into one of two basic types of structures. They're a flat fee or a percentage charge. So flat fees are fees at the DMV, or if you get a ticket, you pay a certain fee. And for those tickets, I think we should just have hours of voluntary service being the mandatory side, and there being no actual money being charged for tickets. Because right now, rich people can just pay off tickets with very little concern, whereas poor people are seriously economically burdened by those tickets because it's a completely regressive, very regressive tax. But then you also have percentage charges on top of certain commodities or products. So you have the sales tax, you have sin taxes on cigarettes, you have fees at the DMV, like I said, you have gas taxes, you have the value added tax, you have luxury taxes, you have property taxes, registration fees at the DMV for your car. I probably already said that. All of these add to the cost of living. They all eat away at consumption, and they all burden poor people disproportionately. And for those three reasons, they need to go. But even beyond that, if you get to specific ones like the sin tax, you're actually targeting someone who buys cigarettes or is addicted to cigarettes and taxing them more because of that addiction or because of that habit. It totally violates equality under the law, that particular one. The gas tax is the argument for the gas tax is that it'll decrease the amount of gas that we use because it increased the cost. Well, it's burdening everyday people, and things like increasing innovations in technology will go a lot further to reducing our consumption of gas, and you're hurting poor people in the interim. So that needs to go. All those regressive taxes need to go. Property taxes in particular are really bad, and registration fees on cars, because what they do is they effectively make it more expensive to own a home or to own a car, which means that poor people, it's more out of the reach for poor people to get those things because they're making it artificially more expensive. Same thing with the sales tax on all goods and services that the sales tax applies to. So all of those regressive taxes need to go. Then that leaves us with progressive taxes. That's the only option we have on the table. It's not a perfect option, but I have a couple ideas for correcting the imperfections within the attempt to enforce a logical progressive tax system. The problems are, first off, the brackets are arbitrary. No one has any real way of picking those brackets, and the rates of those brackets are also arbitrary. No one has there's no real way to pick one or the other. So those are problems you're kind of left with. And also, all of those brackets and all of those rates are constantly becoming more and more regressive because of inflation, because the real value of those wages is constantly going down. The progressiveness of the tax system is being decreased by inflation. So we need a progressive tax system that will counterbalance for inflation, and we need something that hopefully is not as arbitrary in terms of tax brackets or in terms of rates. Now, in terms of getting rid of the arbitrariness of the brackets and getting rid of the inflation concern, I would suggest that we should go with an average income tax. Or I'm sorry, the tax bracket should be based off of below and above average income. Now, to solve, and that average income will self-adjust, and as income inequality increases, it'll slide up further the scale, so it self-adjusts with economic inequality. It's the perfect metric to use for the tax brackets. Now, in terms of the rates, I would suggest this. So below average income and above average income is equal in terms of the number of dollars that are there. So if you have a flat tax at that average income rate, the amount of tax revenue that's generated below and above that rate is equal, 50-50. But I would argue that we should change the system so that flat tax for below average income is changed to 15%, cut in half. So it only generates 25% of tax revenue. And then if you take the above average income, and average income is about 60 grand a year, if you take that above average income and you increase it by 50%, you'll get 75% of revenue from the top half and 25% from the bottom half. So non-arbitrary categories, above and below average income, and then self-adjusting 3-to-1 ratio progressive tax system. That's the only tax system that we need. Except for other types of income that will also be turned into that 3-to-1 ratio progressive tax system. So yeah. Now, separate from those three basic categories, we have a whole other sort of range of taxes that are systemic / business taxes. And I'm going to go through them all, just explaining what we need to do to them, because unfortunately, especially with like rich people taxes, people use that as a political weapon, saying tax cuts for the rich. But if you're referring to a variety of different taxes that have a variety of different policy prescriptions, you're conflating a bunch of stuff, and it's a stupid political weapon. So toss that out. I'm going to go one by one and explain what they are and what the policy change should be. First one is the payroll tax I mentioned earlier, I think. The payroll tax is a dual tax. It taxes employers and employees 7.65% of their income. Or in the case of the employer, it charges them 7.65% of the income of the people that they're paying on payroll. So on the business side, it's a regressive business tax because it's increasing the cost of all labor in America by 7.65%, which that added cost represents a bigger percentage of profits for small businesses as opposed to big businesses, so it's regressive. But it also makes American labor more expensive, so it creates an inherent disadvantage for American labor in the global marketplace. So That's terrible. That's bad. We need to cut that part out. And that is equal, in 2019 numbers, that's equal to about $1.4 trillion a year of tax revenue. So that's a lot of money that businesses will no longer that will no longer be burdening businesses, and that they can go elsewhere, go to income or go to whatever it is. So the payroll income tax on that side needs to be completely eliminated. And then on the other side, you have employees paying a 7.65% income tax, flat income tax. So I'm against it because it's just a flat income tax structurally, and I already talked about what I would want to do with that. But also, that's another $1.4 trillion that could be going in and being that could turn into additional consumption in the marketplace. So I'm all for getting rid of the payroll tax. And Trump's deferral of the payroll tax is genius because it will help massively increase the money that businesses have and the money that people have to spend. So it increases consumption, increases all the things that businesses can do with their money, and creates a massive incentive to invest and to grow right now during this year. And then they're going to make up for it later. That's why it's a deferral, but hopefully we'll actually get a permanent payroll tax cut, and that will be tremendous for the economy. Another example of one of these kinds of taxes is the corporate income tax. So the corporate income tax is just taxing profits of corporations. And the problem with this is it's a double tax, meaning that money will eventually be taxed as personal income, or it will go into the economy and grow the economy and then turn into jobs and then create tax revenue down the road. So businesses can use their profits to pay dividends out to shareholders. That should be taxed as income. They can increase bonuses or pay more to their regular workers and stuff, or their executives or their board members. That will be taxed as income. Then you have stock buybacks, which is when a company buys its own stock. That should be illegal. That's basically corporate insider trading. It's a business using its earnings, using its profits to inflate the value of its stock, but the value of its stock is determined based off of its earnings. So it's total economic perversion and totally useless. Needs to be made illegal. And then the fourth thing they can do with profits is just reinvest it into the business, like I said. So we make stock buybacks illegal, and then we get rid of the corporate income tax altogether. And people argue or complain that big corporations aren't paying enough. They shouldn't be paying any. Right now, we have those corporate tax rates. The big guys are not paying anything, and the small guys are taking all of the burden. So we need to stop burdening small businesses in this land of giants and get rid of the corporate income tax altogether. The next one is the capital gains tax, and it's very straightforward. If you own something, if your stock or your house or your business grows in value, that is a capital gain. There's two types of capital gains. There's realized capital gains and unrealized capital gains. Unrealized capital gains means you have a house, you bought it for 100 grand. It's now worth 200 grand, but you're just living in it and you haven't sold it, so you haven't made that 100 grand off of a sale. That's an unrealized capital gain. A realized capital gain is you sold the house and now you have 100 grand in your pocket, and that is income. Unrealized capital gains are not income. Realized capital gains are income, and realized capital gains should be taxed as income in a 3-to-1 ratio thing, and unrealized capital gains should have no tax whatsoever. I already explained dividends. Tariffs can be a type of systemic or business tax, but obviously the country that's being tariffed is the one feeling it. But it is just worth noting that it is a type of systemic or business tax. Benefits, mandatory benefits to employees increases the cost of hiring employees, and that is a sort of systemic tax, but it's a regressive one because, again, the laws are complex, but it's a burden on the system, and it's essentially a business tax when you mandate that when you hire someone, you pay this extra stuff for this extra thing. And then you have repatriation. Repatriation is when money has been made overseas and they try to bring it back into the United States. We have a repatriation tax where we tax people for doing that. We're taxing people for bringing their money here to do stuff with it. It's the most stupid tax I've ever heard of. We should have maybe a capital deportation tax, but not a capital repatriation tax. That's insane. So that needs to go to zero. Inflation is a type of systemic tax. I already explained it earlier, but it is costing. It's a tax on all savings and debt, labor, and all that stuff. And then the minimum wage. So I wanted to talk about the minimum wage right now. The minimum wage is a. So the minimum wage is a policy that is often thought of in terms of compassion, but unfortunately that's just not the right way to think about it. Now, what happens when you mandate that the minimum cost of something is X, particularly when it's labor? What that means, say minimum wage is $15 an hour. What that means is that if you do not produce more than $15 an hour of value to an employer, you will not get a job and your industry will never exist. Because obviously if they hire you for X wage and you can't produce more than that value for them, they're losing business and the business will just fall apart and collapse and be gone. So obviously that's not good. So I'm against the minimum wage for that reason, but the argument that conservatives make that if you increase wages, that increases the cost of goods faster and everyone's poor as a result, that is wrong. That is completely wrong. I'm against the minimum wage, but that argument is completely crap. Mainly because even if you increase the wages for 1 hour of labor, there's more than one unit of output usually per hour for that increased wage. So you have this increase in cost, but it's spread out over several units, so it actually doesn't add up to a whole lot of extra cost. But there's another way of understanding why this doesn't happen. Obviously, it would fall apart if you went from zero wages to $1. If that's the way things work, then when you went from zero wages to $1 an hour wages, everything would fall apart. And that obviously didn't happen. But the reason why it also doesn't make sense is because the cost of labor inputs will always be less than the cost of production. So if you increase the labor inputs, the increase as a percentage in the cost of production will always be less. So if labor is half the cost of a bag of chips at 50 cents and the bag of chips is $1, and you increase the cost of labor by 25 cents or 50%, up to 75 cents, then the cost of production has only gone up 25% or 25 cents, but the increased consumption power of that person and that laborer has gone up 50%. So relative to labor, the cost of the good has gone down, despite the inputs going up. So it's not always that obvious. I'm against the minimum wage, but the minimum wage is not Satan and it's not the worst thing. It's just not ideal and not optimal. Ooh, that got bright real quick, huh? Okay, that's pretty much it. That's walking through almost everything as it relates to fixing the economy. And if we implemented all these policies, we would grow GDP probably at 5 to 7%, which would be incredible. That's like 2.5 to 3.5 times the current growth rate of the growth rate of the Obama years, I should say. So that would be amazing. I just want to leave you with a couple of closing notes. First off, the package that the government issued earlier this year and any ones that they will do in the future. It's worth understanding that no amount of government spending will ever cause a contraction. I said earlier, as you increase government spending, growth rates will be suppressed beyond 30%. That's true, but at no point in the data does it show that increased government spending as a percentage of GDP ever will actually cause a contraction. It'll just either increase or decrease the rate of growth. And it can bring it down to basically zero, but it will never cause a collapse of the economy by having government spend too much. So that's not, shouldn't be a concern for anybody. So there are actually some other issues, and I'll get to those in future podcasts, in the next few podcasts. There are other issues in America and in the United States that will keep our economy from growing as fast as it can. Welfare is one of those. Our education system is one of those. Our healthcare system is one of those. Systemic racism is one of those problems. High cost of living is one of those problems. So we need to tackle all those kinds of things. I don't know, did I say? Even combating systemic racism is hurting our economy. It just sounds funny, but it's true. So we need to combat all those. The final note that I would like to leave you with is in the 2017 tax bill that was wonderful. It reduced the corporate income tax. It decreased wages, or decreased taxes for all income earners across the board. But above and beyond that, one of the coolest things that it did was it created this, one of the few tax exemptions and credits that I believe is worth having, and that is opportunity zones. So I talked about realized capital gains. What the opportunity zones did is it made it so that in the poorest communities in each state, the governor could designate those areas as opportunity zones, and any company that invested in those areas and held that investment for more than 10 years got a capital gains tax exemption. What did this do? This flooded those areas with in the first year with about $100 billion of new investment that they had not had and they wouldn't have gotten if it weren't for this policy. It gave all of those communities a whole bunch more investment, and it directed private sector investment into those areas, but it didn't give any details as to what the decentralized actors in that area, as to what they need to do. There were no strings attached. It was just saying, direct your investment here. And that, I think, is a tremendously valuable policy. So it's a realized capital gains tax cut or credit for investments held in a certain area for a long period of time. I really, really, really like that tool for helping poor communities, and it's worked very effectively under the Trump administration to help raise the bottom up faster. That's why we've had the bottom quartile of laborers making the biggest gains. I think so. At least blue collar versus white collar, but I think it was the bottom quartile was making the fastest wage gains out of all of the four, which was really cool. But I also would like to take that realized capital gains tax credit and use that to accelerate certain businesses of the future. Now I'm going to talk about this when I get into all sorts of different topics, but keep that in mind, that having a realized capital gains tax exemption or cut or credit for investments held for a long period of time will redirect private sector investment into an area, but all of the rest of the free market is still operating. It's just guiding investment alone into a certain area. Tremendous, tremendous, tremendous. And I'm a big fan, and I would like to use that kind of a tool in the future to accelerate all of the industries of the future. Have an awesome day. I hope this was super valuable to you. Please share, like, subscribe, the whole deal. And if you want to support this channel, leave a comment or leave me a tip. Peace.